I'm Larry Walklin. We're recording this on October 25th, 1996. We're talking with John Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell has recently become a member of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. He's had a long and enviable career in the practice of law as well as broadcast production, ownership of stations, and has become somebody who has been a major figure in Nebraska broadcasting for nearly half a century. John, let's talk about that earliest period of time. How did you happen to get the first contact with radio?
Well, first contact with radio was what was then Nebraska State Teachers College. I'd graduated in 1943 from Longfellow High School in Kearney, Nebraska, and I think the enrollment fee was about tuition was about $22 per semester. So Kearney College gave me an opportunity to go to school as well as all 5 kids in our family, and this was just after the Depression and right during the middle of World War II. So I went to, I'd been debating in high school and involved in speech, so I went to college. I was immediately thrust by Professor Harold Arntz into the speech department, and about the first thing that happened after the first week of school was to put me behind some little box with some pots on and said, "You're going to control the volume of a college campus program that originated on the college campus but was played for a half hour every day live over KGFW, the downtown commercial radio station." So I did that all that year, 43 and into 44, and by the spring of 44 they needed an announcer downtown in the commercial station, and I was given a job, a very, very high-paying job, 18 cents an hour, and I stuck there for the next 4 years, and almost every day, I hardly missed a day, including, Saturdays and Sundays where I would study, and that was the start.
What did you do at the station in terms of the job responsibilities?
The job basically was, I was a sports announcer for all play-by-play, and also did a sportscast every night, the 6:15 sportscast, which was a 15-minute sportscast. Saturdays and Sundays, we were on Mutual Network, and my job was to rip and read the news and study. And so I would study all day long, and whenever Mutual wasn't putting on a newscast, I would run into the newsroom and put together a newscast and deliver a newscast. So actually, the real emphasis was sports. I did high school and college sports, and we did golf tournaments. We did Golden Glove. We did baseball. We actually did a golf tournament every fall at the Kearney Country Club. So that was really my experience. I was not a disc jockey because all music was played at the Lakeside Studio, they called it, which was south of town. And all we did up there was, at the downtown studios, was prepare the news, then worry about remotes and sportscasts, and I did write copy. I remember I was assigned about 16 accounts, and I would try to service those. I didn't sell. Selling was done basically by one person, one of the owners of the station.
Who were the owners of the station at that point?
That was real interesting. The stations were previously owned by the newspaper, the Kearney Daily Hub, but were purchased by Lloyd Skipper Thomas and his brother Anson Thomas. And Skipper, they were both Nebraskans, but Skipper had been in Pittsburgh for some years as head of the Westinghouse radio stations, and particularly KDKA Pittsburgh, and wanted to come back to Nebraska, and he bought both Kearney and KORN, Corn, Fremont, Nebraska. They were 250-watt AM stations. There were no FM stations in those days, and 250 watts amazingly went a long ways because there weren't a lot of other stations around. We would once in a while get a reply from Hawaii, a response from California, or a call-in because of there was a lot of skip waves. But those were the owners.
And Anson Thomas was the manager in the local site for a while.
Anson was the manager, and he was the salesman, and Lloyd didn't really do a lot. He would come down and do some lobbying or some kind of lobbying in Lincoln. And toward the end of the week, he would show up, usually Fridays or Saturdays, and he would go into his office and he would prepare a Sunday broadcast of a half hour, where he would normally either have a guest or he would have his own speech or a combination of both, and it was at 1 o'clock. And I introduced him for 4 years, and it was quite a thrill to have Lloyd Skipper Thomas come home every weekend and deliver a speech, which he read. He typed on his Oliver typewriter by himself and prepared his speech with a lot of news of Nebraska.
Would this be considered a public affairs kind of program, or an editorial, or a commentary?
It was a combination of all. It was he would comment. He would quote a lot from various articles and editorials that he liked. He would express his own comments and opinions, and it was kind of bringing everybody up to date as to what he thought was happening basically in the state.
Did he live in Kearney at this point?
He lived in Kearney with his wife, but he was gone probably 4 or 5 days a week.
Did he do the commentary also on the Fremont station, do you know?
No, he ultimately sold that. They didn't hold on to that too long. And then it became KHUB. It changed its call letters, but and KORN now is a station up in South Dakota, I think.
Mitchell, South Dakota.
In Mitchell, South Dakota, right.
I recall somewhere, I guess in terms of the discussions, that you did some play-by-play with Floyd Kalber, or Color or whatever, when he was with KGFW. He started his career there. What year was that?
He started in 1946, and I had started in 44, and that was 2 years after I was there, and we needed somebody to do color and the commercials because we were doing a lot of sports. And I didn't mention basketball, but we had high school and college basketball, and so we were doing a lot of sports. And for a while, we would always have some different person sitting in with me, and it wasn't too good. It was a little inconsistent. And so Floyd had never been on radio anywhere, and I guess there was an ad placed in the World Herald, and he'd seen it and came out, and I think he started possibly 17 cents an hour, and we were together for 2 years. And he was full time, and I was still going to school, but he was full time with another interesting person by the name of Harry Garrett, who ended up at KHUB Fremont and stayed there until his retirement. I think Harry's still living, but the three of us were there, and a couple of other characters that were around. But Floyd Kalber got his start there, spent 2 years there, and then went to Peoria, Illinois.
What was radio? What was the perception of radio by the audience, the citizens of Kearney in the area at this particular period of time?
Oh, it was extremely important. It was the real voice of the city. It was what you would listen to. There was no you have to remember a world without FM, a world without TV, and there was a daily newspaper in our community at Kearney, and there was KGFW. That was extremely important to the citizenry. It tried to do all things for all people. And radio's changed a lot since then. But you had to play enough music, and you had to try to have enough sports and enough news and enough commentary, enough ag. So it was a station that tried to serve everybody.
What information can you recall about the origination of that station, how it got on the air in Kearney?
I should know more about it than I do, but I know it was started by a person whose name I can't remember right now, in Ravenna. And then after Ravenna, it was moved to a small garage north of the campus of the Kearney State Teachers College. And it stayed there for a while. And then it was moved down to a great old hotel, the Midway Hotel, which was on the corner of 25th Street and Central Avenue, or right on U.S. Highway 30, right in the center of town. And the studios were there on the ground floor of the hotel up until the time that the Thomases bought the station. Then they decided to put all of the music down at the transmitter site, which is down by the river, by the Platte River, and now the interstate is there. But to have a downtown studio where talk would originate and where the sales and programming and administrative officers would be, and the station is still in that same place. Now, the chances are they moved in there probably in the late, I would like to say late 30s, 38 or 39, and so we're talking about 96, so it's been there for a long time.
Where did the call sign come from?
Well, there was, it's an acronym, and one acronym I'm not able to repeat on the air because it was used by the college boys, but the other one was kind greetings, friendly welcome, KGFW, kind greetings, friendly welcome.
Was that an acronym that was developed after the original call sign? Sometimes the original call signs were ones that were arbitrarily assigned by the commission, and then the acronym develops later, and sometimes the acronym comes first.
I don't know.
That's an interesting.
And I'm not sure it's true, but that's what we all kind of accepted as to what that stood for.
Now, despite the fact you're a very successful radio personality, you decided to go into law school. How does law school fit in with your radio interests?
Well, I had known somewhere in my first or second year of college that I probably was headed for law. I was going to be a doctor in high school and was planning on becoming a doctor, but one of my very good friends, Keith Edwards, his dad, C.B. Edwards, was the doctor a general practitioner in Kearney, and I was over their house on occasion, and I would see the life that he had to lead. And we'd sit down and do a nice dinner, and all of a sudden he'd have to get up and say, "I'm sorry, I have to leave." And then I had a little trouble. I cut my hand once, and I saw that blood, and all that blood kind of bothered me. So I started saying, I'm not sure that I'm meant for being a doctor, but I enjoyed speech, and I enjoyed debate. So it looked like law was the right thing to do. And then I had a brother that was quite influential. He was my roommate at home, and the next older brother, George, who is the extremely, we call him the educated Mitchell, because he's not only went through Kearney College, he came down to university for a year, went to Georgetown, got his master's degree, went to the Sorbonne, went to Oxford, has gone to George Washington University. But anyway, he ended up in foreign service at Georgetown. And he convinced me that law was the right thing for me, and I decided that I would apply to go to law school. So I went to law school, and I went to Georgetown. I started in 1947, and returned to Kearney. I kind of wanted to go into politics, and that's why I came home. I could have stayed in Washington. I had some nice opportunities there after law school, but I decided to come back home, and had a very serious race for county attorney where I think I lost by 9 votes, and then I ran against that person later for police judge and won by 11 votes, and then became the justice of the peace, and I actually almost survived off of the fees in those days that a justice of the peace got from mostly traffic cases. So now we're in Kearney from 50 to about 53, and in the meantime, Skipper Thomas has passed away. He was a diabetic, and he passed away, and his wife was attempting to run the station with the help of some other people, and she decided to sell, and the secretary up at the station that I knew quite well stopped by the office one day and says, "John, why don't you buy the radio station?" And I said, "Well, with what, Esther?" I says, "It's hard enough trying to eat." And I was serious. I was married. We didn't have any family yet, but it was difficult. My rent had been $22 up on a second floor, and for my office, and it was $40 for our apartment, and that was quite a bit of money to scrape up. But anyway, we were able to. I started thinking about it, and she says, "Well, a North Platte group is going to buy it if you don't," and so she says, "Try to put something together, because I think Mrs. Thomas would really like to have somebody here buy it." So I put together a group of my mother and my brother and a cousin and two other good friends, and they put up a little money, and I put up none except all of the sweat, and we put it together. We bought that station for $100,000 and put $10,000 down, and each four people put $2,000 apiece, and two people, my mother and my brother, put $1,000 apiece, and that's how we got the station. But then a lot of things happened after that.
What year was this?
That would have been 1953. So that's 53 years ago. 43 years ago.
Now, from the base of operations at KGFW, in addition to your law practice, you continue back in broadcasting, and you buy more stations, and you become continually interested in this. How do you balance the world here of doing both things simultaneously?
Well, it was quite difficult, and we also had some very, very tough times. I mean, how we met payroll, I have no idea. From times I'd get up and sweat it out every day. The worst thing that happened to me is that when I was going through college and was working at the station, the real good morning man, and the only morning man around, was Honest John Jack Lewis. And he was a jolly fellow, a joke teller. He had everybody listening. Everybody knew Honest John at KGFW. Well, in the meantime, a television started in about 1953. And Dr. Brewster of Holdridge started station and put the facilities at Extel. And he hired Jack Lewis to be on television. Well, I kind of wanted to get Jack back into radio, so I told Jack what I was doing, that I was planning on buying, and like to get him back in. And lo and behold, I don't know whether the name of Honest John was really fitting, because within 2 months later, he was part of another group that filed for another frequency at 1460 on the dial in Kearney, an AM station, 5,000 watts. We had 250 watts. And from there on, for several years, it was extremely difficult. The competition was great.
This is KRNY.
KRNY. That was KRNY, Kearney, Nebraska. Finally, they went bankrupt, and then they sold and resold and the like, and we were able to continue. But I didn't really. I love practicing law. I was very much involved, knee-deep in the United States Junior Chamber of Commerce, became their national legal counsel and parliamentarian for a good number of years. And then afterwards, I got immersed in politics in the state. And so I didn't pay a lot of attention to radio. I tried to practice law and try to take care of all of these other things that I was fooling around with. And that was wasting my time, and so I just tried to get by. So it was not it was one of these things where I tried to have a good manager that would run it and get reports, and I would normally stop by once a day and see what was going on. And that's the way I left it, and I probably would not have gone much further than that in radio, but in about 1968 we decided to move to Omaha. And when I got to Omaha, because of some contacts I ultimately had, we started an advertising agency. And in the advertising agency, one day somebody came up and said, "John, there's a station over in Council Bluffs that's really having trouble. And it's an FM station. And I said, hey, don't talk to me anymore about radio. Well, within a couple of months, I ended up buying it. And then one of my managers, that was at Kearney.
This is KRCB.
That was KRCB, AM and FM. My manager, John Howard at Kearney, called. I was right in the middle of a trial, I remember, and the bailiff called me and said, "Mr. Your manager in Kearney wants you at recess." So he says, "There's a station for sale real cheap in Mountain Home, Idaho." I said, "Mountain Home, Idaho? What do we want to do in Mountain Home, Idaho?" And he says, "Well," he says, "I've been out there and I've seen it," and he says, "I think you ought to buy it." So I think we bought that station for $43,000, and we shouldn't have, but we bought it. And then I added an FM station to Mountain Home. It didn't have an FM station. And ultimately we sold it and got out well, but it was a big struggle. And I learned then that I did not want to go into any radio station that was further than I could get to in the morning and maybe get home at night, whether it's by plane or car. So that's how we got into the Omaha market by buying KRCB, and that was in a little house in Council Bluffs next to a church, where a lot of activities I think were going on in that little house before we bought it.
What was the name of the advertising agency?
Young and Mitchell. And it was Ron Young. We started from scratch. Ron Young had been with Coyle as a salesperson, but he felt that he wanted to get into an advertising agency. He didn't have any money, and I didn't have much, but I had enough to get him started. And my wife is an artist, Mary, and so Mary was vice president and in charge of artwork. But after we bought the station, because I felt there was indeed a conflict, other advertising agencies didn't like the fact that we were involved in an advertising agency and also had a radio station. So I ultimately sold it to our interest to Ron Young. And then he ultimately sold out to another agency and then has a little radio station up in Montana now.
So at this point, we're past 1968, as I understand it. You're in Omaha. You have purchased the Council Bluffs licenses. What year approximately was it that you purchased?
73.
Now, a little bit further on, however, you kind of get the radio bug again, and you buy some more stations. How about that?
Well, first of all, we had to worry about these two stations, operating them, and that was not easy. We were an album-oriented rock on FM, and we didn't know what to do with the AM. It was a small AM trying to compete against KFAB, KWOW, and all of the FM stations. So we really started, there was a KLNG that had been in Omaha, and then it switched formats sometime later. So we decided there was an opening, and we started a news talk station in Council Bluffs. It was KRCB for a while, and then we changed the name because those call letters were available to KLNG. So those were those two stations. We had not had a FM station in Kearney. In about 1969, I started a new FM station in Kearney. So that took us up to 4 stations. And then we had the 2 stations in Idaho and ultimately sold those. And then probably almost 10 years ago, so it would be probably 1987, we got a construction permit for a new AM station in Bellevue. There had been applications made several years before that by several people, pardon me, to put that station either in Lincoln or Council Bluffs or whatever, but we filed in Bellevue that didn't have a station. So ultimately we got that construction permit and built what is now known as KKAR. It was 1180 then. Well, that signal wasn't really the best. It was a 5,000 watt, but it still had some trouble because we were 1180 and WOW was 590, and because of something that happens where double harmonics, I think is the name of it, 590 times 2 is 1180, there were certain problems that were created. So it wasn't the best signal for us, and we ultimately decided we had to do something, so we ended up buying a legendary old station that was having a lot of trouble, Coil, which was 1290 on the dial, and we switched our K-car to 1290 to give it a better signal, and we switched Coil to 1180. And then I guess we did something after that. We about a year and a half ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, we got involved in North Platte. So that would be 89 to 90 to 91. We bought one station, KXNP, from Neil Nelkin in North Platte, and then within a year or two, we ended up buying KODY, AM and FM. And the rules then required us to get rid of one of the FMs, which was really too bad because we could use it today. And so we ended up in North Platte with an AM and FM, in Kearney with an AM and an FM. We were in Omaha with the 2 AMs and an FM, and then we saw an opportunity of buying what was a Lincoln licensed station, but it called itself KYNN then, but before that it was KFMQ, an album-oriented rock station. The owners were in Wisconsin, and they had moved the studios to Omaha, trying to make it an Omaha station, but it was still Lincoln licensed. And we bought that probably in spring of 94. And that's where we are today.
John, when you originally applied for and got the construction permit for KKAR when it was on 1180, there were those folks who said that was your legal sophistication which helped you get past a lot of competing applicants and get the construction permit because you knew how to analyze the details. Talk a little bit about that ability to get that license.
I don't think it had anything to do with any astuteness on my part. It had more to do with probably listening to some other advice. The advice came really from Dick Chapin, one of the best broadcasters in the country, living here in Lincoln. And Dick had pointed out to me the availability of this frequency earlier. And then as we were getting ready to file in another conference I had with him, because I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. Why would any fool want to get involved with another AM station when TV was rampant, FM was strong and the like, and but we decided that it certainly was a better frequency and a better opportunity than the AM that we had, which was KLNG 1560 in Council Bluffs. So in the course of the discussions between Chapin and my Washington attorney, Vince Pepper, who was a classmate of mine at Georgetown and became a communications attorney, and who I still employ as my Washington counsel, it was suggested that the better chance to avoid hearings would be to file in a community that didn't have a radio station, had sufficient population to justify having a station. So we took a long shot and said, hey, nothing to lose. Why file in Council Bluffs where WOW had filed and others were going to file, and others had filed in Lincoln. I think Roger Dodson had filed with a group in Lincoln.
Pride group, yes.
So we took that long shot of filing after we analyzed it and said, hey, I'm not sure it was anything to do with my legal ability. It had to do with it made sense, and any good businessman would have said, hey, this is worth a try. And we did, and we won without hearings. And so the station is licensed to Bellevue, Nebraska, which of course is just a good part of the Omaha metropolitan community.
Now the rules have changed, of course, as you alluded to a little earlier, but at this time you then still, as I understand it, control KLNG in Council Bluffs, and you get the license for KKAR in Bellevue. Is there an overlap problem there, and what do you have to do?
No, we had to sell KLNG, but the FCC gave us time to do that, and we ultimately sold it to Robert Wilkins, who's operating it as a religious station. It's still there, still operating.
Yeah, and what happens to the FM now? The Council Bluffs FM, the original
The
KRCB
FM, the original FM, when I bought KRCB FM in 1973, we immediately made a search for a call letter change. It was operating as an album-oriented rock station, AOR, and we filed and got new call letters called KQKQ. And we called it KQKQ for from 73 to 80, and about 78, the Meredith Publishing Company that was operating WOW, AM and FM, decided that they wanted to also do album-oriented rock. So for about a year and a half or two, we struggled. Their numbers were not real great. Ours were not real great, but they had a much deeper pocket. So we ultimately realized that we probably should change formats. And a party that had been working with Coil for years and then been down at Florida with Y100 wanted to come back to Omaha because that was his home base. That was a party by the name of Bill Cunningham. He convinced me that we should change, and there was an opening, a hole, as the radio people call it, a hole in the market for CHR, or contemporary hit radio, or top 40 radio, that Todd Storrs had really started in Omaha, and that Coil had carried on even better than Todd Storrs for many years under the direction of Don Burden, who owned the stations, and then ultimately lost them. But in about 1980, we switched to Contemporary Hit Radio, CHR. In addition to KQKQ, we added on the name of Sweet 98. So it is still KQKQ, Sweet 98, 98.5 on the dial, and remains a CHR station.
Now, John, you mentioned the names of some people that you have had as your employees, and some folks that you've had as your friends and advisors and so forth. Maybe you can expand a little bit first in terms of some of the folks who have worked with you in your stations as your managers or program directors or other kinds of folks whose names are familiar to people in Nebraska broadcasting.
Well, probably the most, other than Floyd Kelber, the most famous person that actually worked for me was a young 17-year-old that we hired in Kearney, who at about the age of 15 and 16 was playing records at the youth center at Harmon Park, where I had worked for $1 a day, cutting weeds at the tennis court and putting the roller over the clay courts and checking out equipment with a gal by the name of B.J. Holcomb, who was my classmate and who did a lot of work for the university radio and television. And B.J. and I were classmates. But we heard what was going on down there, and I had, this would have been somewhere in the late 50s, and the kid sounded real lively, and his name was Art Ferguson. And so we decided to put him on at night, and we did, and it really went over well with the young people, but we needed a new morning man, and because honest John Jack Lewis was giving us a lot of trouble, we decided to give that a try. So we moved Art Ferguson to mornings, and I would say within a year and a half, he was so good, or so hot, so clever with the boards and what he said and how he handled music, that he was hired by a station in Wichita, and then from Wichita I went to Oklahoma City, and he became Charlie Tuna. And then Charlie Tuna became very famous across the country and in California and on the Army and the service networks, radio stations, and he'd been on there for years. He was probably our most famous. There have been some others, and frankly, they kind of escaped me. But we've been very fortunate. Most of our people have stayed with us. We have people with us for 37 years now, and some managers that have been with us 28 or 29 years. So we haven't lost an awful lot of people. And I don't think I'm able to say I know there have been some others that have done well, and if I had some of my other radio people around, they'd remind me who they are.
On the management side, one of the people who was a player for your company was a person who is in the Nebraska Broadcasters Hall of Fame as well, Ralph Bodine.
Oh, yes. But that was much later. Ralph Bodine was a very interesting person. He was born and raised in Omaha and started out in a newspaper at the World Herald, and then went, I understand, to KOWH. And from there, he kept moving up and ultimately became the president of ABC networks, radio networks, the top guy in New York. And he went by way of Chicago, I think WLS, I believe, for a while, and then New York. And he allegedly was the one that put together the concept. He and Ed McDermott, who is still living and who is the syndicator for Rush Limbaugh, and who just became the Broadcaster of the Year this year, or a couple of weeks ago in Los Angeles. They're responsible for putting together a network for ABC where they were able to send out 4 different formats, which was revolutionary. And today, a lot of syndicators put out many networks, but Ralph Bodine was in charge of that. He ultimately got tired of New York, loved to play golf, loved warm weather, so moved his family, 4 kids and all, to Phoenix. And he remained in Phoenix for many years, doing basically consulting work for radio stations, got off into some manufacturing company for a while, then ended back up in consulting and radio, and I met him accidentally at a radio function in New Orleans, and we hired him, and shortly thereafter, because I needed a manager in Omaha, and he was with us starting KKAR. He helped put that together, construct it and all, and unfortunately I did not know when I hired him that he had some prostate cancer problems. He thought he had them under control. They flared up again, and he was probably with us about 4 years before passing away. But he's a famous name in broadcasting.
Now, KKAR, when it comes on, is really almost revolutionary in terms of the changes of technology and the news talk format and the computers and so forth. How did that all kind of fit together with your overall plans?
Well, there was a real question as to what should we do with that AM station. And so we hired a research firm. I think it's called Research Inc. out of Seattle. And spent quite a bit of money having a research program conducted, and they indicated to us at that time probably the best thing for an AM station to do would become a all news or a news talk station in Omaha, because there were none at that time. The only thing that was close was the amount of news that WOW and KFAB were doing, but both of those were playing a lot of music, and they were all-purpose stations and trying to appeal to different audiences. So there was obviously a hole at that time. We decided to make it an all-news station. One of the influencing persons was Steve Brown, who was another rather famous name in radio, who I think at a very young age, was the disc jockey of the year out in Los Angeles. But Steve Brown had been the right-hand man for Don Burden at Coyle, and Don Burden had put together stations in Omaha and in Indiana, Indianapolis, and in Portland. And Steve was very much involved in the programming aspects of those stations. And Steve Brown saw the hole in the Omaha market, and he started working on me real hard for, before we ever put KKR on the air, to do something, and wanted to be part of it. So we finally made a decision to go all news, and we started out with a very large news staff, I think 17 or 18 people for radio, which is a lot of people. And it was all news. I mean, between local news and network news, we were CBS. We did it a little different. We sent our news guys out with video cameras, and they would get audio on the video, and they would come back, and we tried this out for a while, looking at the video and seeing if there were parts of that story that we really wanted, but then when we'd only take the audio. That was a clever idea, but it really was a little cumbersome. So we soon forgot the use of the cameras, and as we continued with news, we realized that it's pretty hard to keep people listening, and in this business today, whether we like it or not, you have to have good ratings. And to get good ratings, you have to have quarter-hour shares. And to get quarter-hour shares, you have to have people listening longer. So time spent listening was extremely important. And if you have an all-news station and you really like news, you're going to tune in, and after 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, maybe you have all you want, and you don't want to necessarily hear the same thing or something similar. And so it was difficult to get people spending a lot of time listening to your station. You'd have a lot of cumulative listening, people that spent 5 minutes or more during a week that would come into your station, dip in and dip out. You'd have a lot of cum, but you wouldn't have much time spent listening. So it became evident that that probably was not quite the way to go. And I would say, starting within about a year after we were on all news, we started deciding that we ought to be moving in some direction toward news talk. And about 1988, I was told about a guy by the name of Rush Limbaugh that was doing something in New York, and if you're going to go into talk, maybe you ought to be thinking about this guy, because he seemed to be doing something. And Ralph Bodine was very close with Ed McDermott, and Ed from ABC. Ed McDermott then had become president of ABC following Ralph Bodine. He then left there and started the EFM, Edward Francis McDermott EFM network, and was able to find this young guy out in Sacramento by the name of Rush Limbaugh. So I was told by Bodine and Ed McDermott, you better come back to New York and audition this guy that's on, and we did. And I tried to audition him in our hotel room, but after 5 minutes, my wife would come over, and I didn't know that. I'd be reading the newspaper, and then the radio's not on. I said, Mary, what happened to the radio? And she said, I turned it off. And I said, why'd you turn it off? She says, you can't put that on. You can't put him on in Omaha, Nebraska. And I said, why not? He says, you're a Democrat. I said, well, what's that got to do with it? And she said, well, he's so right-wing. And I said, what's that got to do with it? And I said, let me listen to him. So I'd turn it on, and after a while, she'd turn it off again. And it was the day before the Dukakis-Bush election. And I can remember he said, Rush Limbaugh said some very nasty things about this guy, Dukakis. And that also irritated my wife. And as I listened, though, I saw that he was I had a feel that he was an entertainer. And when I came back and we put our heads together, I made the decision, and it was a tough decision, but we were 33rd in the country to put Rush Limbaugh on. And so that was our transition from all news to news talk. Now, KFAB was not news talk yet. So it looked like it was still the logical thing, and had they been news talk, they undoubtedly would have gotten Rush Limbaugh from us, or before we got him, because they've done everything they could in the meantime to try to get him. So we then made our change, put Steve Brown on the morning show and the like, and made our movement into the news talk area, put Rush Limbaugh on in Kearney at KGFW and in North Platte at KODY, and those markets are all quite similar, being news talk stations for their AM stations.
Now, John, you mentioned your Democratic Party affiliation. You become quite a prominent person in terms of the Democratic Party, and this takes some time away from the radio business and from the practice of law. How again do you reconcile all of these kinds of things going on at the same time?
Insanity. It really helps a lot. You have to be a little nuts to do all those things. I was always I was always an active kid.
You were the Democratic National Committeeman for a while, were you not?
I was a Democratic state chairman during the years. They were the Kennedy-Johnson years, and they were the Brooks-Morrison Exxon years, and then up to the Kerry years. I would say from about 58 to 72, I was quite active, and it's kind of funny because we still have Frank Morrison around, and Jim Exxon around, and Norman Kravotion around, and Frank Barrett. About 8 of us decided in about 58 that it wasn't a matter of being Republican or Democrat. It was more a matter of the fact that the state was too one-sided. There was ridiculous people that were candidates on the Democratic side, so you had no choice. And we felt that if you're going to have good government, the real purpose for political parties was to try to get the best candidates you could, and then the populace had a choice between two good people, and we couldn't lose that way. So we scratched around and we found Ralph Brooks, who was making great speeches around Nebraska and superintendent of at schools at McCook. And lo and behold, Ralph Brooks won, and that was the real beginning of the Democratic Party. And then Frank Morrison insisted that I become the state chairman, and that was a big battle because we had to oust people that were entrenched in Omaha with Bernie Boyle and the like, and Jim Exxon was a great political worker. He was a wonderful guy to work with, as well as guys like Sorensen, and who became lieutenant governor, and
Phil Sorensen.
Phil Sorensen, who was a very able person. We had a wonderful group that worked together very closely, and it's interesting because this is a little group can start a movement, and we started a movement not for what we thought was for the better, because we think that we've offered good candidates to the state, and my explanation to people as to why did you win. Why have you won so often? Because we've offered better candidates.
Now, I'll go back to the point that you made when you were talking about your wife mentioned to you that she thought it was unlikely that you'd make a decision to put Rush Limbaugh on because of your interest in the Democratic Party and so forth. But over a period of time, you operate with lots of different formats in the radio business, and you make lots of kinds of decisions that show a very wide range, well beyond probably your personal taste. How do you analyze what kind of programming should be on, what kind of stations can go where, and what the political as well as economic considerations have been over the years? Maybe just an example.
Well, it's not easy, and we are doing it today yet. Every day we do that. Do we have the right format? And one rule that radio station owners use is that if you and your wife like it, you know it's the wrong thing. and if you don't like it, maybe you ought to look at it. So what we've had to do and what is happening a lot in radio and television is the use of consultants and research firms. And even with the last entry into Omaha Lincoln, which is the station KGDE called The Edge, which is alternative rock.
The former KMFMQ that you mentioned
Right.
that you bought 2 years ago, roughly.
Correct. We did research. We did rather expensive research, and we listened to the research people make their presentation, and as they presented each format down the row, we were hanging our heads thinking, there's nothing here, and finally they came to their last one, and they said, there is a potential home run here. And so we moved over, and it was alternative rock, which was still in the college campuses, really very strong, but had not emerged into the commercial scene real well, but was coming on, and now has really become almost mainstream. So we don't pick just things that we want to hear. I do love news talk. That's kind of my background, but we have to be very careful with it. And it is a very expensive format. I mean, you can run other stations for maybe a third or a fourth programming expense, particularly if you go into syndication. So how do we make our decisions? We try to use research. Some of them are kind of gut decisions. This last decision we made on The Edge, all of my managers, we have a management team, they wanted to go to hot AC. What is hot AC? I don't know what hot AC is, but it's somewhere a little quieter than CHR, but it's getting closer, and supposedly it's on the upper demographics, maybe in the 30-35 female. Everybody wanted to go hot AC. And we finally said, wait, we're not going to make this expenditure, this investment, without some research. And research all said, hey, hot AC was not the number one thing to do, although it was second. But by far, it was alternative rock.
John, sometimes people think that the principal owner of a broadcast facility's personality and goals are really reflected in the way that the station is operated. What do you think of that idea?
I think that's probably true. Some people hide it better than others. Some people stay totally away from it and leave it up to programmers to make all decisions. And my involvement is somewhat different. I probably make the final decision, but I always ask, what is your recommendation? And I'll either get a recommendation from a manager or from a management team. And I try not to push my own personal desires, except there are some exceptions where I want certain things done. I think certain things ought to be done in the community. Right now, I just sent out a note yesterday saying from now on in Omaha, after every station break, there's going to be locally owned and operated, because we are about the last remnants of locally owned ownership, and not quite the last, but we're the last large group in Omaha. And I think it's important that people know that we're not owned by a San Diego group or a Milwaukee Journal group out of Milwaukee or another group out of Wichita. So there are some decisions that I do make that obviously reflect the wishes of an owner. Obviously I wanted Big Red football on, and we worked hard at it, and there were some people on our staff that didn't. They felt it was too expensive, and it was and is too expensive. It does take over a lot of time and personnel, but it does add some other dimensions. So yes, I think an owner does have a tendency to push in his ideas.
As we're coming close to the end, I'm going to ask you the toughest question. What's the most fun you've had in the radio business?
I think probably the most fun has been the various conventions that I've gone to. I used to go to all the Bar Association conventions because over the years, for 45 years, I was an active lawyer, and I tried a lot of cases. I handled a lot of matters for a lot of clients until about the last year. And I enjoyed that because I was doing things for people, but I'd always tell my lawyers, I said, hey, we're pretty dull when we go to conventions, and the radio people have a lot more fun. So believe it or not, at my age, going on to 150, last week my wife and I were in California, and we're proud of ourselves that even after a heart attack, 2 nights in a row we took in 5 different parties, fun parties, like the House of Blues and the Westwood Club and all that kind of stuff. But those associations, it's not just the fun, it's the people, the association with these people over the years that we've been able to make a lot of good friends across the country, and that's been the enjoyable part.
What's radio do for society right now?
I think radio is just absolutely fabulous, and it is getting better. Because it is so personal, it is so mobile. It's the thing that you can take with you in the car, into the stadium, into the bathroom, into the living room, down in the basement. And it's free. It's great choices in radio today. Tremendous choices. The formats are all there. And then I think I'm a great believer in public radio also. And I think the combination of commercial and public radio has been wonderful for America, and that we've got a fabulous menu of radio.
How does radio help democracy?
Well, I just think so unbelievable that we have radio with so much, an industry with so much free speech. I mean, I have studied the possibility of a Howard Stern on one of our stations, and I say, well, no, he's got the right of free speech, but I don't want to put him on because I don't believe in vulgarity, and he has a tendency to use a little bit too much of it. But he's on the one end, and then we have a lot of right-wing people on the other end. We have a lot of liberals in between. I think if there is no forum that offers more free speech than radio.
What do you think the changes in the radio business, the allowing, for example, a single operator like yourself to own more than one station or up to 4 stations in a geographic area will do in terms of the future?
Well, there's a serious question whether a single operator like me can survive. And then that was one of the big discussions in last week's conferences in Los Angeles, radio conferences in Los Angeles. What has happened is that there is tremendous public money that has been brought together by large corporations who've gone to the public, and they don't go to the bank, they go to the public and sell stock, so they don't have to pay back principal or interest, so they don't have a debt to service, and they have these large public funds that they're able to buy up, and that's what's happening in Omaha. It's happening around the country, and so I think independents like me will be swallowed up. The prices that are being offered today are so ridiculous that you can't turn them down unless you just want to, be real stupid. And it's probably going to happen to me. It's happened to others clear across the country. There's some good part to it, though. I'm not trying to be negative about it. I think radio now, with falling into a cluster of several groups, will be much more competitive with TV, billboards, and of course the big monster newspaper than it ever has been before, because a group can now go in and be competitive.
John, we've covered a lot of ground. What might I have asked that I've missed so far that you might like to get on the record here?
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity of being involved in radio in Nebraska. I appreciate Nebraska very much because it offered all of us 5 little kids that were born by 2 parents that came from overseas, of Greek parents, of Greek ancestry, and an opportunity to get through school. And I think all of my work has been in Nebraska, and I've It's kind of hard to believe sometimes that you could have been working for KGFW for 18 cents an hour and end up owning the station and having a few other stations. And where could that happen other than America?
John, thank you very much. We're recording again on October the 25th, 1996. Our guest has been John Mitchell, who is the latest member of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. John, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.